we're reporting live from JD News. We're talking about why is Shanghai limiting their population? What is global transition all about? Mortality declines, fertility transition, and population growth. The classic demographic transition. Let's start with our first expert in decoding and demographic description, Ms. Cheryl Azan.
What this news article is all about? China addressing the issue of overpopulated cities is to relieve the future growth of this important city, to plan the future with the accurate. What do you think is Shanghai limiting population to 25 million only? For the Chinese analysis, a research fellow at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences predicts that the poor will bear the growth of the new population limit the most, because the government will begin tearing down cheap housing lot systems for the global trend. Is China's way of limiting the people in the city and the land made available for development reasonable? Why or why not? It is why imposing such a limit, he warns, is unpractical and against the social development trend. China similarly hopes to cut the population of Beijing at 23 million by 2020. Notes the Guardian, because big cities disease by their own definition. What is the implication of this news to global population? Population growth will do us we don't get under control. The city has also said it would intensify efforts to protect the environment and historic sites as part of its master plan. Can we also do the same in the Philippines? Let women rule the country. Those who have education background of taking creditabilities as well the development. Bill and local government provide tax credit and incentives to encourage new job creation, job retention, and employee skill training to attract new capital investment. This should imply the one-child policy to limit and evaluate in mathematical outcome in the future. Before they started the demographic transition, life was short, births were many, growth was low, and the population was young. The transition began around 1800 with declining mortality in Europe. It has now spread to all parts of the world and is projected to be completed by 2300. This global demographic transition has brought momentous changes, reshaping the economic and demographic life cycles of individuals and intersecting population. Since 1800, global population size have already increased by a factor of 6, and by 2000 will have risen by a factor of 10. There will then be 50 times as many elderly but only 5 times as many children. Thus the ratio of elders to children will have risen by a factor of 10. The length of life, which has already more than doubled, will have tripled, while birth per woman will have dropped from 6 to 2. In 1800, women spent about 70% of their adult years bearing and rearing young children, but the fraction has decreased in many parts of the world to only about 14% due to lower fertility and longer life.
It was a remarkable knowledge, and we will be back after this commercial.
Pagbangon tayo. Miss, kape nga.
3-in-1?
Hindi, yung puro.
Nescafe Classic. Bunga ng 100% puro at natural. Kaping-kape ang lasa at aroma para 100% gising ang isip, katawan at diwa.
Good job, June! Para sa pamilya ko.
Dito ka na sa 100% puro at natural. Nescafe Classic.
Let's proceed to the mortality declines by Mr. Alfero. Mr. Alfero, take it away.
Hello, good morning everyone. I'm bachelinkelseylpero and I'm going to present the topic mortality declines, fertility declines, and population growth. The class demographic transition starts with mortality declines, followed after a time by reduced fertility. Mortality declines, the beginning of the world demographic transition occurred in the Northwest Europe, where mortality began as regular declines around 1800. The first stage of mortality declines is the reduction in contagious infectious diseases that are spread by air or water. Starting with the development of the smallpox vaccine in the late 18th century, preventive medicine played a role in mortality declines in Europe. Improved personal hygiene also helped as income rose and as the genital disease became more widely. Another major factor in the early process of growing life expectancy is improvement in nutrition. Human mortality was reduced by improvement in storage and transportation that permitted integration of regional and international food markets. smoothing across local variation in cultural output, secular increased income lead to improved nutrition in childhood and throughout life. Life expectancy is still positively associated with height in the industrial country population, possibly reflecting childhood health condition. In recent decades, the continued reduction in mortality is due to reduction in chronic and degenerative diseases, notably heart diseases and cancer. Funded biomedical research has played an increasingly important part in the Human Genome Project and stem cell. In India, life expectancy rose from around 24 years in 1920 62 years today, again up 48 years per calendar years, over 80 years. In China, life expectancy rose from 41 in 1955 to 70 in 1999, again up 65 years per years, over 40 years, shows a rapid rate of increase in low-income countries will surely taper off as mortality levels approach those of the global leaders. On the optimistic side, graph that plots up highest national female life expectancy at 10 for each calendar years from 1840 to 2000. The point fall close to a straight line starting at 55 years in Sweden and ending at 85 years in Japan, with a slope of 2.4 years per decade. If we boldly extend the line forward in time, it reached 97.5 years by mid-century and 109 years by 2100. These optimistic projections are based on extrapolation of trends in age-specific death rates over past 50 or 100 years. This approach implies more and more modest gains for the high-income nation of the world, with average life expectancy approaching 90 years by the end of the 21st century. Female advantage in life expectancy has also risen. In the more developed countries, the sex gap in life expectancy has increased from 5.0 in the early 1950s to 7 years today. In the less developed countries, it has grown from 1.7 years to 3 years today.
Was surprised by the amount of mortality declines back then and now. We'll be back after this commercial.
Sorry mga bros, muna na ako ha. May tournament pa ako eh.
Tournament? Eh, umalis na yung tren!
What? Hindi to pwede!
Eh, di abulin natin.
Tara! Oh! Wala na tayong gas! Hoy!
Eto, fuel for adventure.
Naku! Abot ba ako nito? Uy! Yun na! Ma'am, sir, pakibilisan lang po. Hindi na natin maabutan!
Akong bahala.
Seryoso ka? Anong para?
Oh! Anong sabi ko sa'yo?
Fuel for adventure!
Have now is our journalist from Fertility Transition, Miss Mary Arbis.
Hello, I'm Mary Ruth Arbis, reporter from Group 1. Fertility transition between 1890 and 1920. Marital fertility began to decline in most European provinces, with a median decline of about 40% from 1870 to 1930. Most economic theories of fertility start with the idea that couples wish to have a certain number of surviving children. rather than births per se. If this assumption holds, then once potential parents recognize an exogenous increase in child survival, fertility should decline. Some of the improvement in child survival is itself a response to parental decisions to invest more in the health and welfare of a smaller number of children. These issues of parental investments in children suggest that fertility will also be influenced by how economic change influences the costs and benefits of childbearing. Bearing and rearing children is time-intensive. Technological progress and increasing physical and human capital make labor more productive, raising the value of time in all activities, which makes children increasingly costly relative to assumption goods. Since women have had primary responsibility for childbearing and child-rearing, variations in the productivity of women have been particularly important. Rising incomes have shifted consumptions toward non-agricultural goods and services for which educated labor is a more important input. Overall, these patterns have several effects. Children become more expensive. Their economic contributions are diminished by school. Time and educated parents have higher value of time, which raise the opportunity cost of childbearing. Furthermore, parents with higher incomes choose to devote more resources to each child, and since this raises cost of child, it also leads to fewer children.
It was like crystal clear information. Be back on air.
Wala akong ibang nais kundi maparating sa'yo, maibigay ng tagumpay pangangailangan mo, kahit na malayo pang patutunguhan ko, lalakbayin basta para sa'yo.
Sino ka man, nasaan ka man, nandito ang Shopee para sa inyo. Shopee 66, mid-year sale. Shop na!
Add to cart.
This last speaker will talk through the population growth and some classic demographic transition. Mr. Anzales?
Population growth. Population growth, the combination of fertility and mortality determines population growth. Between 1950 and 2050, the actual and projected trajectories for the more, less and least developed countries are plotted. One is a trajectory for Europe from 1800s to 1950. Between 1950 and 2050, the actual and projected trajectories for the more, less and least developed countries are plotted. To add more historical depth, I have added two historical trajectories. One is trajectory for Europe from 1800s to 1950. India had higher initial fertility and mortality than Europe, as did the least developed countries relative to the less developed countries in 1950, which in turn had far higher mortality and fertility than the more developed countries in that year. Except for India, the starting points all indicate moderate for Europe to rapid for least and less developed countries' population growth. All three groups are projected to approach the zero growth contour by 2050. The more developed countries from below and least developed countries from above. There has been rapid global convergence in fertility and mortality among nations over the past 50 years, although important differences remain. This convergence of fertility and mortality is in marked contrast to per capita GDP, which has tended to diverge between high-income and low-income countries during this time. Today, the median individual lives in a country with a total fertility rate of 2.3, barely above the 2.1 fertility rate of the United States, and the median life expectancy at birth of 68 years compared to 77 years for the United States. Wilson, 2001. Some consequences of the demographic transition. The 3 centuries of demographic transition from 1800 to 2100 will reshape the world's population in a number of ways. The obvious changes are in the rise in total population from 1 billion in 1800 to perhaps 9.5 billion in 2100, although this long-term estimate is highly uncertain due largely to uncertainty about future fertility. The average length of life increases by a factor of 2 or 3, and the median age of the population doubles from the low 20s to the low 40s. Many more developed countries already have negative population growth rates, and the United Nations projects that the population of Europe will decline by 13% between now and 2050. But many other changes will also be set in motion in family structure, health, institutions for saving and supporting retirement, and even in international flows of the people and capital.
Extravagant thanks, Mr. Antalis. We were being serious economic and political changes. Nonetheless, life and aging, capital-intensive and culturally diverse, high-income countries should be present, provided our institutional structures are sufficiently flexible to allow us to adapt our life cycle plans to changing circumstances, and provided we are willing to pay for the health care and extend the retirement that we apparently want. Population studies help us to know how far the growth rate of the economy is keeping pace with the growth rate of the population. If population is increasing at faster rate, the pace of the development of the economy will be slow. And that's for today. I, Kathleen Buliran, your anchor for GD News. And good morning.